For the better part of 7 years, Adam Schiff had persistently and relentlessly informed the American populace that he held incontrovertible evidence. Yet, on this momentous day, for the inaugural time in his extensive political journey, the individual positioned directly across the dais from him was the one truly in possession of empirical data, and it was entirely unrelated to the former president. Tulsi Gabbard ceremoniously unsealed a classified dossier within the hallowed halls of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and articulated 6 precise words that effectively signaled the disintegration of Adam Schiff's political trajectory. Senator Schiff, every single fabrication generates a documentary trail, and I have acquired the entirety of your paper trails. The events that transpired over the subsequent 4 hours would result in the total structural collapse of the man whom CNN had once characterized as the ethical compass of the legislative branch. You are encouraged to engage with this content by signaling your approval, as you are currently observing an occurrence that is entirely without precedent within the sphere of American governance. The definitive account of a prominent congressional figure being overwhelmed by the weight of his own declarations, his personal records, and his persistent inaccuracies, each one meticulously documented over a 24-year period. Adam Schiff had cultivated his professional standing upon a singular and remarkable aptitude, the ability to articulate a narrative with such persuasive force that few ever felt compelled to verify the underlying veracity of his claims. From his tenure as a federal prosecutor to his leadership of the House Intelligence Committee, his role as the primary impeachment manager, and eventually his position as a United States Senator, every professional advancement was constructed upon the same rhetorical scaffolding narratives and accusations presented with the unwavering poise of a performer reciting a script invisible to all others. He had frequently asserted that he held more than mere circumstantial proof regarding foreign collusion. He incorporated entirely fabricated citations from the president into the official congressional record, subsequently characterizing the act as mere parody. He participated in the most restricted intelligence consultations in the nation, only to emerge and disclose classified details to members of the press just hours afterward. And in every instance, the media provided enthusiastic approval, while the cameras continued to record, and no one sought to hold him to a standard of accountability. However, on this day, an individual of significant consequence finally would. Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, did not establish her career through rhetorical flourishes. Rather, she built it upon a foundation of genuine service, including 2 combat deployments, a Bronze Star, and 2 decades of military commitment. She had adhered to the same oath that Adam Schiff had taken. Yet the fundamental distinction lay in the fact that she actually honored it, and she now possessed the documentation to highlight who had failed to do so. The hearing room within the Russell Senate Office Building was filled to its maximum capacity on a Tuesday morning that political veterans would eventually describe as the most significant legislative inquiry since the Watergate scandal. Yet, in contrast to the events of Watergate, the figure facing imminent professional collapse was not a sitting president, but a senator who had dedicated his entire career to the dismantling of others. Adam Schiff had personally requested this specific hearing, which was the primary detail that everyone would recall in the aftermath. He had initiated the process himself. His office had dispatched a formal communication to the Senate Intelligence Committee, insisting that DNI Tulsi Gabbard appear to address what Schiff described as the partisan weaponization of the partisan intelligence sector and the inadequate leadership of the nation's most sensitive bureaus. The letter had reached CNN within an hour of its delivery. By that same evening, every prominent news network had organized discussion panels to analyze Schiff's ostensibly courageous stance against the new administration's security appointments. Rachel Maddow dedicated a significant portion of her program to applauding Schiff's unrelenting vigilance in the protection of democratic frameworks. Schiff's team had meticulously organized every detail, preparing press releases for immediate distribution at critical junctures of the hearing and providing talking points to sympathetic journalists who would offer real-time interpretations of the events. Even his arrival was carefully orchestrated, as he traversed the primary corridor where photographers could capture his focused and somber demeanor. Flanked by two high-ranking assistants, carrying voluminous binders of prepared interrogations, he appeared as a man approaching his own inaugural celebration, yet what he failed to realize was that he was actually approaching his own professional post-mortem. Tulsi Gabbard had arrived 30 minutes prior through a secondary entrance, carrying only a single briefcase, without a staff entourage or pre-arranged media presence. Simply a combat veteran, equipped with 5 distinct colored folders, and the full legal authority of the United States intelligence apparatus. The hearing room itself held a specific irony that would not be fully recognized until much later. It was the exact environment of wood-paneled walls and camera equipment where Schiff had spent years as the dominant interrogator, the man who posed devastating questions, dictated the narrative, and decided which information the public would receive and which would remain suppressed. He was as familiar with these chambers as a seasoned actor is with a stage, however. For the first time in his career, Adam Schiff was not the individual directing the inquiries. The committee chairperson formally commenced the hearing at 9:00 a.m., with C-SPAN providing a live broadcast. While CNN and MSNBC shifted to comprehensive coverage, and Fox News had been streaming since 8:30 a.m. Following established protocol, the committee invited Senator Schiff to provide his opening statement first, considering that he had been the one to request the inquiry. Schiff rose to his feet, not out of necessity, but because he always stood when the cameras were active. It was a habitual gesture from his days in the courtroom, a physical demonstration of authority over those who remained seated. He fastened his jacket with practiced precision, adjusted the placement of his microphone, and delivered a 15-minute opening address that was, by any standard, a masterpiece of political theater. He systematically critiqued Gabbard's credentials with clinical references to her lack of conventional intelligence experience. He questioned her national allegiance by highlighting her 2017 meeting with the Syrian head of state. He invoked the legacy of dedicated intelligence professionals who had committed their lives to national security only to be replaced by appointees chosen for their loyalty rather than their skill. He even managed to incorporate a reference to his own congressional censure, framing the event as evidence that he posed a threat to those who evaded responsibility, eliciting affirming nods from the Democratic senators present. It was 15 minutes of impeccable political performance, with every syllable delivered with the fervor of a man who sincerely believed himself to be the protagonist of the narrative. Upon concluding, Schiff resumed his seat, straightened his necktie, and directed his gaze toward Tulsi Gabbard with the complacent expression of a strategist who had successfully defined the parameters of the conflict. Tulsi did not react immediately. 5 seconds elapsed, then 10. The silence was so absolute that the low hum of the ventilation system became clearly audible on the broadcast. Finally, Tulsi spoke, her voice calm and measured, entirely lacking the theatrical cadence that Schiff had utilized for the preceding 15 minutes. "Have you concluded your remarks, Senator?" Schiff nodded, a faint smile lingering on his face. "I believe I have articulated my position with sufficient clarity." "You have," Tulsi responded, "with great clarity, because in the last 15 minutes you have performed exactly as you have for 7 years. You spoke with immense self-assurance while presenting absolutely zero evidence." The smile on Schiff's face faltered slightly. "The distinction between today and every other day over the previous 7 years," Tulsi continued while reaching for her briefcase, "is that today, the individual sitting across from you actually possesses the evidence." She unlatched the briefcase, and extracted 5 folders, each a different color: red, blue, black, white, and yellow, arranging them in a systematic line on the table before her. Each folder was substantial in thickness and bore official classification stamps and agency emblems. The yellow folder, positioned last, was notably more voluminous than the others. Schiff leaned forward instinctively, attempting to discern the labels. Tulsi observed the movement. "Do not be concerned, Senator. You will examine each one in sequence." She rested her hand upon the red folder. "Let us begin with the fabrications." Tulsi unsealed the red folder with the clinical precision of someone who had prepared for this moment not for dramatic flair, but for the purpose of operational effectiveness. Inside were not classified dossiers or secret surveillance logs, but rather printed transcripts of televised appearances, congressional records, and official public declarations. "Senator Schiff," Tulsi began, "I wish to be entirely transparent. Before we continue, everything contained within this initial folder is a matter of public record. Every statement I am about to recite was uttered by you on national television to the American public. I have no need to declassify any information here because the proof of your lack of candor is accessible to anyone with a screen and an internet connection." She looked toward the committee members. "The issue is not that the proof was concealed. The issue is that no one in this chamber ever bothered to compile it in a single location and read it back to him." She retrieved the first printout, March 22, 2017, on Meet the Press. Then Congressman Schiff asserted, and I quote, "I can inform you that the case is more significant than that, and while I cannot provide the particulars, there is more than circumstantial evidence." She placed the document down and selected the next March 2, 2017, on MSNBC. "I believe there is direct evidence in the dealings between the campaign and the Kremlin." "Direct evidence? Senator, those were your precise words." Another document followed April 2, 2017. On CNN, you informed the host that there was ample evidence of collusion in plain sight. Another, from July 16, 2018, you stated the evidence was damning and hiding in plain sight. Another, from February 2019, you initiated what you termed a comprehensive investigation into presidential finances and foreign ties, informing the public that your committee had identified significant evidence of coordination. Tulsi organized the documents in a neat arrangement, each one visible to the recording equipment. She then reached for a second collection of papers, these bearing official government insignias. Now, let us examine what the actual inquiries concluded. She held up the first official report, the Mueller report, 2 years, $40 million, 500 witnesses. The finding? She read directly from the text. The investigation did not establish that members of the campaign conspired or coordinated with the foreign government in its election interference efforts. She set it aside and picked up the Durham report. Conclusion: the FBI possessed no legitimate basis for initiating the investigation. The narrative was, in the words of the report, based on raw, unanalyzed, and uncorroborated intelligence. Next, she presented the findings of the Inspector General Michael Horowitz's investigation into the surveillance warrant applications, identified 17 significant errors and omissions. The presiding judge stated clearly that the court had been misled. She positioned these findings opposite the television transcripts. 2 rows of documents, one representing Schiff's assertions and the other representing the official conclusions that invalidated every claim. And here, Senator, is where the situation becomes particularly problematic. She produced a copy of the 2018 Schiff memo. This is your rebuttal to the allegations of surveillance abuse. In this document, you stated that officials did not abuse the process or omit material information. Yet, the Inspector General found exactly the opposite, that the process was abused. that information was omitted, and that the unverified dossier you supported played a central role in obtaining the warrants. Schiff attempted to interrupt Director Gabbard. You are presenting these findings entirely out of context. The assessment clearly indicated, I am not discussing foreign interference, Senator. Tulsi's voice intervened without increasing in volume. I am discussing you about what you stated on camera to the American citizens repeatedly for years. She paused for 3 seconds. Schiff prepared to continue. I have more, Tulsi said simply. Part 3. The Architecture of Parody and the Blue Folder. Tulsi Gabbard's hand remained steady as she transitioned from the red folder to the blue one, a container that held the evidence of what she characterized as the systematic theatricalization of the American legislative process. The atmosphere in the Russell Senate office building had transitioned from one of mere political tension to a palpable sense of historical gravity, as the spectators realized that this was no longer a routine oversight hearing, but a meticulous deconstruction of a career built upon the manipulation of public perception. As she unsealed the blue folder, she did so with a deliberate rhythm, allowing the rustle of the paper to resonate through the silent chamber. Within this dossier lay the documentation of an event that many Americans remembered, but few had analyzed through the lens of constitutional ethics. The occasion upon which the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee chose to replace the literal transcript of a presidential communication with a creative writing exercise of his own design. Director Gabbard addressed the committee with a tone that was devoid of malice, but saturated with a profound sense of professional disappointment, noting that in the realm of high-stakes intelligence, the fidelity of a transcript is the bedrock upon which national security decisions are formulated. She articulated that when the individual entrusted with the oversight of the nation's most sensitive secrets decides that the truth is insufficient for his narrative goals, the entire structure of democratic accountability begins to fracture. She requested that the digital displays in the room be activated, and as the footage of the 2019 hearing flickered to life, the contrast between the Adam Schiff on the screen, confident, commanding, and dismissive, and the Adam Schiff sitting in the witness chair became a visual metaphor for the erosion of political invincibility. The video depicted Schiff reciting a version of a phone call that bore little resemblance to the actual text, using a cadence that was clearly intended to elicit a specific emotional response from the viewing public, rather than to inform them of the facts. Tulsi paused the recording at a critical juncture, where the on-screen Schiff could be seen looking directly into the camera as if he were delivering a monologue in a Shakespearean tragedy. She pointed out that this was not a casual conversation at a political rally, but a formal proceeding in a committee room where the rules of evidence and the solemnity of the office were supposed to be paramount. She analyzed the linguistic choices Schiff had made during his parody, highlighting how he had inserted words like dirt and favor in contexts that the actual transcript did not support, effectively manufacturing a confession where none existed. When the video reached the point where Schiff defended his actions by labeling them as parody, Tulsi turned back to the present-day senator and noted that the American people do not elect representatives to provide comedy or satire during impeachment proceedings. They elect them to handle the truth with the utmost care. Furthermore, the blue folder contained more than just the video evidence. It held the internal communications that revealed the premeditated nature of this performance. Tulsi began to read from a series of intercepted or subpoenaed emails between Schiff's senior communications staff and operatives within the National Party infrastructure. These documents detailed a coordinated effort to ensure that the parody would be the leading story on every evening news broadcast. One email specifically mentioned the need to create a viral moment that would bypass the need for a complex legal explanation of the actual evidence. This, Tulsi argued, was the smoking gun of a politician who viewed the Constitution not as a guide for governance, but as a script for a television production. She detailed how talking points were distributed to friendly media outlets hours before the hearing began, ensuring that the parody would be framed as a brilliant rhetorical device rather than a deceptive fabrication. The depth of the blue folder-esque contents extended into the psychological impact of such actions on the intelligence community itself. Tulsi spoke of the career officers who spend years learning to provide objective, non-partisan assessments, only to see their work distorted for a performance of a lifetime. She highlighted the emails from Schiff's chief of staff, which explicitly used the word performance, suggesting that the primary goal of the hearing was not the discovery of truth, but the maintenance of a specific political trajectory. By the time she closed the blue folder, the image of Adam Schiff as a champion of the rule of law had been replaced by the image of a director overseeing a high-budget political drama, where the facts were merely suggestions and the audience's emotions were the ultimate prize. Part 4. The Shadow of Ethics and the Black Folder. The transition to the black folder marked a significant shift in the hearing's emotional temperature, moving from the cerebral analysis of political theater to the visceral reality of human tragedy and the ethical responsibilities of leadership. As Tulsi Gabbard rested her hand on the dark surface of the folder, a hush fell over the room that was fundamentally different from the previous silences. It was a silence born of the realization that the next segment of the testimony would deal with the dark intersections of power, money, and criminal negligence. The name Ed Buck was not merely a footnote in this narrative. It was a symbol of the moral compromises that occur when the pursuit of political funding supersedes the protection of the vulnerable. Tulsi began this section by establishing the grim facts of the Ed Buck case, not as a political attack, but as a matter of criminal record. She detailed the horrific nature of Buck's crimes, the luring of homeless and marginalized men into a residence for the purpose of predatory behavior that ultimately resulted in multiple deaths. Her voice remained steady as she recounted the names of the victims, ensuring that their humanity was not lost in the clinical setting of a Senate hearing. She then turned her attention to the financial records contained within the black folder, which documented the extensive contributions Buck had made to the party and, specifically, to the campaign of the man sitting across from her. While the dollar amount of the direct contribution to Schiff was relatively small in the grand scheme of modern campaigning, Tulsi argued that the significance lay not in the quantity of the money, but in the quality of the silence that followed the initial reports of Buck's behavior. The core of the black folder's evidence was a meticulously constructed timeline that compared the public reporting of the deaths in Ed Buck's apartment with the actions, or lack thereof, taken by Adam Schiff. Tulsi pointed out that as a representative of a district in close proximity to the crimes and as a prominent voice for justice and human rights, Schiff's failure to distance himself or return the funds for over 2 years was a staggering dereliction of ethical duty. She produced records of community activists, mothers, and advocates for the marginalized who had reached out to political leaders in California, begging them to acknowledge the danger posed by Buck. She noted that while these activists were shouting for justice, the senator was utilizing his platform to discuss international conspiracies, seemingly indifferent to the tragedy unfolding in his own political backyard. The folder also contained photographs and event logs that placed Schiff and Buck in the same social and political circles on numerous occasions. Tulsi clarified that she was not suggesting a criminal conspiracy between the two men, but rather a culture of willful blindness. She argued that when a major donor is involved, the standards of scrutiny that Schiff so vigorously applied to his political enemies seemed to vanish. She highlighted the hypocrisy of a man who claimed to fight for the conscience of Congress while remaining mute, as members of his own donor class were implicated in the deaths of vulnerable citizens. The evidence in the black folder suggested that the senator's commitment to justice was selective, applied only when it served his national profile and ignored when it threatened his political alliances. As she moved deeper into the folder, Tulsi presented internal staff memos that discussed the optics of the Ed Buck situation. These documents revealed that the decision to finally return the money was not motivated by a sudden awakening of conscience, but by a calculated assessment that the negative publicity had reached a tipping point. One memo explicitly stated that they should wait for the news cycle to move on before making a quiet donation to a charity. This revelation struck at the heart of Schiff's public persona, suggesting that even his acts of supposed restitution were merely tactical maneuvers. By the time Tulsi concluded the black folder, the room was heavy with the weight of the names she had read, men who had no voice in the halls of power, but whose stories had finally been brought into the light as a testament to the cost of political indifference. Part 5. The Sanctity of Secrets and the White Dossier. As Director Tulsi Gabbard reached for the fourth container, a folder of pristine white, the collective pulse of the room seemed to quicken. This was the segment of the hearing that transitioned from ethical scrutiny and political performance into the high-stakes arena of national security law and the potential for criminal prosecution. The white folder was not merely a collection of observations. It was a curated archive of technical data that sought to prove a direct correlation between the senator's access to the nation's most sensitive secrets and subsequent appearance of those secrets in the public domain. Tulsi began by contextualizing the gravity of the sensitive compartmented information facility, commonly referred to as the SCIF. She described the rigorous protocols, the heavy steel doors, the absence of electronic devices, and the underlying philosophy that within those walls, information is handled with a reverence for the lives it protects. She articulated that for a chairman of the Intelligence Committee, the SCIF is not just a room, but a sacred trust. However, the evidence she began to produce suggested that for Adam Schiff, the SCIF might have served as a resource for political currency. Tulsi produced a series of logs that documented the senator's entries and exits from these high-security environments over a 14-month period. These were not just dates and times. They were timestamps of access to specific intelligence products, intercepted communications from foreign adversaries, satellite imagery of covert operations, and human intelligence reports from sources embedded in hostile territories. She then presented a parallel set of documents, the publication times of articles from major media outlets. The demonstration was methodical and devastating. Tulsi walked the committee through 12 specific instances where the timeline was too compressed to be coincidental. She detailed an occasion in January 2020 where the senator received a briefing on sensitive counterintelligence concerns regarding a foreign power's influence operations. According to the logs, he exited the SCIF at 1:23 a.m. By 2:17 p.m. A major cable news network had published a breaking news report that mirrored the substance of the briefing with startling specificity. Tulsi noted that the report included nuances that were only available to those who had seen the classified slides. She repeated this process for 11 other dates, creating a rhythmic pattern of access followed by disclosure. The most technically sophisticated portion of the white folder was the metadata analysis. Tulsi clarified that the intelligence community had not monitored the content of the senator's calls, a process that would have required a specific warrant. They had analyzed the patterns of communication originating from devices associated with his office. The data showed that within the golden hour following his departure from a classified briefing, there was a consistent surge in communication between his staff and a specific group of journalists known for their coverage of national security leaks. She produced a heat map of these interactions, showing a direct link between the end of a briefing and a call to a reporter at the Washington Post, or MSNBC. Tulsi argued that this was the weaponization of the intelligence community's own work. She spoke of the men and women in the field, officers whose names are never known and whose sacrifices are never publicized, who take immense risks to gather this data. She described how a single leak designed to win a news cycle or damage a political opponent, could burn a source, compromise a collection method, or alert an adversary that their communications were no longer secure. Her voice, usually calm, carried a sharp edge, as she noted that in her military experience, such actions were not seen as whistleblowing or parody, but as a fundamental betrayal of the people in uniform. Schiff's reaction during this phase was one of forced neutrality. He pushed the microphone away, a gesture that signaled his refusal to engage with the technical evidence. However, the absence of a rebuttal was, in itself, a form of testimony. Tulsi noted that the unauthorized disclosure of classified information is a violation of 18 U.S. Code. Section 798, a statute that carries severe federal penalties. She calculated the potential legal exposure, 12 counts, each carrying up to 10 years in prison, not as a threat, but as a sober assessment of the legal reality facing the senator. By the time the white folder was closed, the narrative had shifted from a political dispute to a potential espionage case, leaving the room in a state of stunned reflection on the cost of the politics of the leak. Part 6. The architect of the echo chamber and the yellow folder. The final folder was the largest and most complex. A vibrant yellow that stood out against the mahogany table. This was the complete picture, the synthesis of all previous sections into a singular, unified theory of operation. When Tulsi opened it, she did not immediately read from a document. Instead, she stood and approached an easel where an aide assisted her in unfolding a massive, intricately detailed network diagram. It was a visual representation of what she described as the Schiff operation, a self-reinforcing ecosystem designed to manufacture and sustain political narratives regardless of their proximity to the truth. At the center of the diagram was a large circle containing the senator's name. Radiating outward were 4 distinct branches, color-coded to represent the different sectors of his influence: the media network, the political operative network, the intelligence analyst network, and the financial donor network. Tulsi began to trace the connections with a laser pointer, explaining how information flowed through this system. She described a closed-loop mechanism where Schiff's office would provide an exclusive but unverified tip to a media contact. Once the article was published, Schiff would then appear on television to cite that very article as independent corroboration of his own claims. She highlighted a cluster of names on the diagram, former high-ranking intelligence officials who frequently appeared as analysts on cable news. Tulsi produced evidence that these individuals, while presenting themselves as objective experts, were in regular, documented contact with the senator's staff. Their role in the ecosystem was to provide the veneer of authority. When Schiff made a claim about foreign collusion, these analysts would go on air an hour later to state that his claims were consistent with what they had seen during their time in government. It was a masterpiece of psychological operations, Tulsi argued, designed to make a manufactured narrative feel like an organic consensus. The yellow folder also contained a deep analysis of the media amplification system. Tulsi identified 17 journalists who she claimed functioned more as operational assets than as independent reporters. She showed how their reporting followed a specific cadence: the initial leak, followed by a depth piece that added speculative details, followed by analysis from the former officials. This coordinated timing was designed to overwhelm the public's ability to think critically, creating an environment where the narrative became reality simply through repetition. Tulsi then turned to the most damaging part of the yellow folder, the proof that this system remained active even after multiple official investigations had debunked the core claims. She noted that after the Mueller and Durham reports concluded there was no conspiracy, the Schiff operation simply pivoted to attacking the investigators themselves, using the same network of media and former officials to discredit the findings. This, she argued, was the ultimate evidence of bad faith. It wasn't about seeking the truth. It was about maintaining a political weapon at all costs. As Tulsi reached the conclusion of her presentation of the yellow folder, she addressed the senator directly. She noted that he had spent years warning the country about a vast conspiracy to subvert American democracy. She paused, looking at the complex web of lines on the diagram, and then at the man at the center of them. "You were right, Senator," she said. "There was a conspiracy, an organized, sustained effort to mislead the American people using the tools of the state and the media. You were just wrong about who was leading it." This was the moment that led to Schiff's instinctive attempt to leave the room. The visual of him standing up, looking at the exit, and then realizing the cameras were capturing his moment of flight, became the definitive image of the hearing. It was the physical manifestation of a man realizing that the echo chamber he had built was no longer soundproof. The walls were closing in, and for the first time, he was the one being analyzed, mapped, and held to account by the very same types of evidence he had once used to dismantle others. Part 7. The Silence of the Accountable. When the presentation of the folders concluded, a silence descended upon the Russell Senate office building that was unlike any other in modern political history. It was not a silence of respect, or even of shock, but a silence of total, absolute finality. The room seemed to contract around the witness table where Adam Schiff sat, his hands now resting flat on the surface, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere between the yellow folder and the microphone he no longer wished to touch. Tulsi Gabbard remained standing, her posture as straight and disciplined as the folders she had just laid out. She did not seek a mic-drop moment. She simply waited for the reality of the evidence to settle into the collective consciousness of the committee and the millions watching at home. The 15 seconds that followed are now studied by political scientists and body language experts as the Schiff silence. On live television, across every major network, there was no commentary, no graphics, no scrolling tickers, just the image of a man who had spent 24 years mastering the art of the retort, suddenly finding himself intellectually and rhetorically bankrupt. Tulsi's question, "Senator, do you wish to respond?" hung in the air like a physical object. Schiff's jaw worked silently, a rhythmic clenching that was the only sign of life in an otherwise frozen visage. He opened his mouth twice, but no sound emerged. The man who had given 423 televised interviews, who had read parody into the record, and who had always had a perfectly crafted soundbite, was now mute. This silence was more damaging than any confession could have been. In the world of political optics, a denial can be debated, and an explanation can be spun. But silence, in the face of overwhelming documentary evidence, is seen as the ultimate admission of defeat. It represented the collapse of the narrative-driven reality that Schiff had curated. When the words are proven to be hollow and the evidence is shown to be fabricated, the only thing left is the void. Tulsi finally broke the silence, not with an attack, but with a series of formal, administrative declarations that signaled the beginning of the legal aftermath. She announced that as the Director of National Intelligence, she was referring all evidence from the hearing to the Department of Justice for a criminal investigation into the unauthorized disclosure of classified information. She announced a referral to the Senate Ethics Committee and the immediate suspension of the senator's security clearances. These were not just suggestions, they were the cold, hard gears of the state beginning to turn against one of its own. When Tulsi finally gathered her things and walked out of the room, she did so with the quiet efficiency of a soldier who had cleared a target. She didn't look back at the cameras or the gallery. She simply exited, leaving the senator alone at the table with his empty water glass and the live microphone. Part 8. The Fallout and the New Standard. The immediate aftermath of the hearing was a period of unprecedented political realignment. Within 90 seconds of the hearing's conclusion, the Schiff silence was trending globally. But beyond the viral clips and the memes, the structural impact on the American political landscape was profound. The network diagram from the yellow folder became a roadmap for a broader clearing of the institutional house. Several high-profile journalists whose names appeared on the chart were placed on administrative leave by their networks, as the public began to demand a distinction between reporting and operational amplification. The intelligence community, too, underwent a period of soul-searching. The former IC officials who had been part of Schiff's echo chamber found their credibility evaporated overnight. Booking requests for these analysts dropped to near zero, as networks realized that presenting them as objective experts was now a liability. In the hallways of the CIA and the NSA, there was a quiet sense of relief among the rank-and-file professionals who had felt their work was being used as a political football. The hearing had demonstrated that accountability was not a partisan concept, but an operational necessity for the survival of the agencies themselves. The legal process moved with a deliberate, grinding speed. A grand jury was impaneled within months, and the metadata evidence, combined with testimony from staff members who had been granted immunity, led to an indictment that shocked the nation. Adam Schiff became the first sitting senator to face charges under the Espionage Act, related to the mishandling of classified information for political purposes. The trial would eventually become a landmark event, a courtroom battle where the parody defense was finally tested against the rules of evidence and found wanting. For the American public, the hearing served as a great awakening regarding the mechanics of political deception. The 5 folders, red, blue, black, white, and yellow, became a shorthand for a new standard of accountability. Citizens began to ask not just what are they saying, but what is the evidence, and who is in the network. Now, the culture of the unnamed source and the anonymous leak faced a reckoning, as the public realized how easily these tools could be used to manufacture a reality that didn't exist. The legacy of Tulsi Gabbard's 5 folders was not the destruction of a single man, but the restoration of the idea that, in a democracy, the truth must be handled with the same discipline and honor as the flag itself. The silence that ended the hearing was not just the end of a career, it was the beginning of a more sober, evidence-based era in American governance. It was a reminder that while you can build a career on words, you can only sustain a nation on facts. And as the investigations continued and more folders were opened, the American people rediscovered a fundamental truth that no one, no matter how articulate or powerful, is above the documentary trail of their own actions. Part 9. The Technical Architecture of the Metadata Evidence. The implications of the white folder necessitated a much deeper dive into the methodology of the intelligence community's findings, a process that Tulsi Gabbard described as the clinical application of forensic science to political conduct. In this segment of the hearing, the focus shifted from the what to the how, providing a level of detail that aimed to preempt any claims of partisan bias or technical error. The metadata in question was not merely a list of phone numbers, but a sophisticated mapping of human behavior and institutional betrayal. Tulsi explained that the data captured the digital heartbeat of the senator's office, revealing a pattern of activity that was inconsistent with routine legislative duties, but perfectly aligned with the requirements of a high-speed media leak operation. She detailed how the analysis utilized advanced temporal correlation algorithms to bridge the gap between the physical actions within the SCIF and the digital echoes in the Washington press corps. The evidence demonstrated that the senator's staff maintained what appeared to be standby communications with specific news desks, ensuring that once a classified briefing concluded, the narrative could be pushed into the public sphere with maximum velocity. This was not the work of a lone whistleblower acting on conscience, it was a coordinated machinery of disclosure. Tulsi presented charts that illustrated the burst patterns of outgoing calls and encrypted messages that spiked precisely as the senator exited secure facilities, a phenomenon that occurred with such statistical regularity that the probability of it being accidental was calculated at less than 1 in a billion. The technical analysis also extended to the devices themselves. While the content of the messages remained shielded by encryption, the size of the data packets and the duration of the connections provided clues to the nature of the information being shared. Brief, intense bursts of data following a signal's intelligence briefing suggested the transfer of specific coordinates or technical parameters, while longer, sustained connections after a human intelligence briefing suggested a more narrative-driven disclosure of source identities or operational locations. Tulsi argued that this level of forensic detail transformed the allegations from political rhetoric into a matter of hard, cold fact. It was a demonstration of how modern technology could be used to hold even the most powerful oversight officials accountable to the very standards they were supposed to enforce. Part 10. The philosophical collapse of the conscience narrative. Beyond the legal and technical evidence, the hearing represented a profound philosophical reckoning for the American legislative tradition. Adam Schiff had long positioned himself as the conscience of Congress, a title that implied a moral superiority and a commitment to the foundational principles of the Republic that transcended partisan squabbles. However, as the evidence from the 5 folders accumulated, that persona began to undergo a process of total deconstruction. Tulsi Gabbard addressed this directly, noting that the conscience of a leader is not found in their televised performances or their crafted social media presence, but in the consistency between their public pronouncements and their private actions. The contrast presented in the hearing suggested that the senator's conscience was a carefully manufactured political product, designed to shield him from the very scrutiny he directed at others. Tulsi explored the concept of noble cause corruption, a psychological phenomenon where an individual justifies unethical or illegal actions because they believe their ultimate goal is morally superior. She argued that Schiff appeared to have fallen into this trap, believing that his pursuit of a particular political outcome justified the fabrication of evidence, the leaking of classified data, and the maintenance of ethically dubious financial ties. This analysis struck a chord with the public, offering a lens through which they could understand how a talented and intelligent leader could lose their way in the pursuit of power. The hearing suggested that when a leader begins to view themselves as the conscience of an institution, they often stop listening to their own actual conscience. The reliance on parody as a defense for fabrication was cited as the ultimate example of this disconnection. Tulsi argued that in a healthy democracy, the truth does not need a creative interpretation to be effective. The power of the truth lies in its objectivity, not in its emotional resonance. By attempting to improve the truth through performance, Schiff had effectively abandoned the very principles he claimed to defend. This philosophical collapse was, in many ways, more devastating than the legal referrals, as it invalidated the entire moral framework upon which his career had been built. Part 11. The systemic impact on intelligence and oversight. The revelations concerning the Schiff operation triggered an immediate and necessary debate about the future of congressional oversight of the intelligence community. For decades, the system had relied on a delicate balance of trust between the executive agencies that gather intelligence and the legislative committees that oversee them. The evidence presented by Tulsi Gabbard suggested that this trust had been systematically exploited for partisan gain. The hearing revealed that the intelligence community itself had become wary of sharing its most sensitive products with the committee, fearing that their work would be used as fodder for the next news cycle, rather than as a tool for national security. This trust deficit had operational consequences that extended far beyond the walls of the hearing room. Tulsi described how intelligence officers in the field, those working in high-threat environments where a single leak could mean a death sentence, had begun to self-censor their reports, withholding certain details from congressional briefings to protect their sources. This represented a fundamental breakdown of the oversight system. If the committee cannot be trusted with the truth, it cannot perform its constitutional duty. The hearing served as a call to action for a total reform of how classified information is handled within the halls of Congress, suggesting that the era of gentlemen's agreements regarding security was over. The proposed reforms included the implementation of stricter metadata monitoring for all committee members, the requirement for independent audits of Schiff access logs, and the creation of an autonomous ethics body with the power to strip security clearances without political interference. Tulsi argued that these measures, while restrictive, were the only way to restore the integrity of the process. She noted that the goal was not to weaken congressional oversight, but to strengthen it by ensuring that it could no longer be used as a platform for unauthorized disclosures. The Schiff era of oversight was characterized as a cautionary tale of what happens when the watchers themselves are not being watched, leading to a system where the pursuit of a headline becomes more important than the protection of the nation. Part 12. The Psychological Reckoning of a Nation. In the days and weeks following the hearing, the American public underwent a collective psychological reckoning. The Schiff silence, that 15-second void on live television, became a mirror in which many citizens saw the reflection of their own exhaustion with the narrative industrial complex. The hearing had pulled back the curtain on the closed-loop system of media and political coordination, revealing how easily public opinion could be manufactured through the use of unverified leaks and expert validation. This realization led to a significant shift in how the public consumed news and interacted with political figures. There was a growing demand for primary source accountability, as citizens began to bypass the traditional gatekeepers and seek out the raw evidence for themselves. The popularity of the network diagram from the yellow folder was a testament to this desire for transparency. It provided a visual map of the connections that many had intuitively felt but could never prove. This democratization of scrutiny was one of the most significant unintended consequences of the hearing. It empowered the public to question the expert consensus and to demand a higher standard of proof from their leaders. Furthermore, the hearing forced a difficult conversation about the role of partisanship in the pursuit of justice. The fact that the evidence against Schiff was presented by an individual with a background in both parties, a former congresswoman from his own party, who was now serving in a nonpartisan intelligence role, added a layer of credibility that was difficult for the traditional political machines to predict for. Dismiss. It suggested that there are certain values, such as the sanctity of classified information and the integrity of the truth, that must remain above the partisan fray. The psychological impact was one of both disillusionment and hope-disillusionment with the specific actors who had failed the system, but hope that the system itself still possessed the mechanisms to identify and correct its own failures. The silence of Adam Schiff was, ultimately, the sound of the truth, finally catching up with the narrative. And in that silence, a nation began to listen for something more substantial than a story. Part 13. The Triangulation of Truth. A comparative analysis of official inquiries, the most intellectually dense portion of the red folder, which Tulsi Gabbard returned to for a moment of final clarification, involved the direct juxtaposition of the three most significant investigations in modern American history: the Mueller Report, the Durham Report, and the Inspector General's Review by Michael Horowitz. To understand the magnitude of the Senator's departure from reality, one must analyze these three pillars of evidence not as separate entities, but as a unified body of work that collectively invalidated his 7-year narrative. Tulsi articulated that while the senator had often cherry-picked sentences from these reports to support his televised claims, a holistic reading of the documents revealed a starkly different conclusion. She began with the Mueller Report, the document that was supposed to be the definitive proof of the direct evidence Schiff had claimed to possess. Tulsi pointed out that despite the unprecedented resources allocated to the special counsel, $40 million, and hundreds of thousands of documents, the report's conclusion was not ambiguous. It stated clearly that the investigation did not establish coordination. She noted that Schiff's subsequent claim that collusion is not a legal term was a linguistic retreat intended to move the goalposts of accountability. If the direct evidence he claimed to see did not lead to a legal establishment of a crime, she argued, then the evidence itself was either non-existent or fundamentally misunderstood by the chairman. The Durham report provided the necessary context for how the investigation began in the first place. Tulsi used the documents in the red folder to show that the FBI's reliance on the Steele dossier, a document Schiff had famously read into the congressional record, was characterized by Durham as a failure of basic investigative standards. She highlighted that Durham's findings suggested the entire premise of the collusion narrative was built on a foundation of political opposition research rather than verified intelligence. By connecting Schiff's public defense of the dossier with Durham's findings that the dossier was raw, unanalyzed, and uncorroborated, Tulsi demonstrated that the senator was not a victim of bad information, but an active promoter of it. Finally, the Horowitz report acted as the bridge between the political narrative and the procedural abuse. Tulsi focused on the 17 significant errors and omissions identified in the FISA applications. She reminded the committee that Schiff had issued a formal memo in 2018 claiming that the FBI and DOJ had not abused the process. Horowitz's findings did more than just disagree with Schiff. They proved his memo was factually incorrect. This triangulation of evidence, Mueller finding no conspiracy, Durham finding no predicate for the investigation, and Horowitz finding systemic abuse in the warrants, formed a comprehensive refutation of Schiff's entire career as a national security authority. It was the triple crown of investigative finality, leaving no room for the senator to maneuver. Part 14. The global geopolitical fallout and the fragility of alliances. The implications of the white and yellow folders extended far beyond the domestic borders of the United States, touching upon the delicate architecture of international intelligence sharing. Tulsi Gabbard addressed the quiet crisis that had been brewing among America's closest allies, the members of the Five Eyes community and other strategic partners, who had watched with growing alarm as classified intelligence became a tool for domestic political warfare. She argued that when a high-ranking official like the chairman of the Intelligence Committee is perceived as a source of unauthorized leaks, the entire global structure of security cooperation begins to fray. Tulsi revealed that several allied intelligence services had subtly reduced the volume and sensitivity of the information they shared with the U.S. During the period covered by the metadata analysis, the fear was simple. If a piece of intelligence could be used to score a political point on an American cable news network, it was no longer safe to share. She spoke of the informational paralysis this caused within the American intelligence community, as officers struggled to provide briefings that were both useful to policymakers and safe from public exposure. The hearing suggested that Schiff's actions had inadvertently weakened the nation's early warning system by incentivizing secrecy even among friends. Furthermore, the parody of the presidential phone call had significant diplomatic repercussions. Tulsi noted that world leaders communicate with the President of the United States under the assumption of confidentiality and professional decorum. When the chairman of a primary oversight committee fabricates the contents of such a call for domestic consumption, it sends a message to the world that American institutional stability is compromised. She argued that this weakened the president's hand in international negotiations, as foreign counterparts became wary of their words being parodied or distorted by political actors in Washington. The geopolitical cost of the performance was a loss of American prestige and a degradation of the trust that is the lifeblood of international diplomacy. Part 15. The digital afterlife memes, metrics, and the shift in public discourse. The 15 seconds of silence that concluded the hearing did not end with the gavel. Instead, it began a new life in the digital ecosystem, where it was dissected, remixed, and distributed with a velocity that the traditional media could not control. This digital afterlife represented a fundamental shift in how political accountability is processed by the public. Tulsi Gabbard's methodical presentation had provided the raw data, but the internet provided the cultural judgment. The Schiff silence became a shorthand for the moment when the narrative industrial complex finally ran out of things to say. The metrics were staggering. In the first 48 hours, the clip of the silence was shared over 500 million times across various platforms. But more significant than the numbers was the nature of the content. The memes were not just jokes, they were tools of political analysis. They contrasted Schiff's 423 television appearances with his 0 words at the witness table, creating a visual narrative of the great unmasking. This grassroots reaction suggested that the public had developed a sophisticated immunity to the types of rhetorical maneuvers Schiff had utilized for years. The silence was perceived as the ultimate system error in a politician who was viewed as a high-functioning messaging machine. This shift in discourse had a secondary effect on the media outlets mapped in the yellow folder. For the first time, audiences began to hold news anchors and analysts accountable for their role in the Schiff operation. Social media users compiled supercuts of journalists nodding along to the very claims that had just been debunked in the hearing. The expert status of many cable news regulars was challenged in real time, leading to a measurable decline in trust for the specific programs that had served as Schiff's primary amplification platforms. The hearing had demonstrated that in the digital age, a performance can be dismantled just as quickly as it can be built, provided there is a persistent and evidence-based counter-narrative. Part 16. The Gabbard Doctrine. A new era of oversight and accountability. As the dust settled on the Russell Senate office building, a new philosophy of governance began to emerge, one that commentators quickly labeled the Gabbard Doctrine. This doctrine was built on the principle that intelligence oversight is an operational function, not a political one. It posited that the power of the oversight committees is derived from their commitment to the truth, and that this power is forfeited the moment it is used for partisan objectives. Tulsi Gabbard's conduct during the hearing, her refusal to engage in theatricality, her reliance on documentary evidence, and her focus on the protection of sources and methods became the new template for institutional accountability. The legislative legacy of the hearing included the introduction of the Intelligence Oversight Integrity Act, a piece of legislation that sought to codify many of the reforms Tulsi had suggested. This included the mandatory declassification of certain SCIF access logs after a specific period, and the implementation of criminal penalties for the knowingly false or fabricated presentation of intelligence information by members of WTC, Congress. The act was designed to ensure that no future chairman could ever again use the parody defense to avoid accountability for misleading the public. It represented a significant reassertion of the rule of law over the rule of the narrative. For Adam Schiff, the conclusion of the hearing was the beginning of a long and isolated legal journey. He remained a man of words, but they were now the words of legal briefs and defense motions rather than television soundbites. His story served as a modern-day Icarus tale, a warning of what happens when a politician believes they can fly above the truth on wings made of rhetoric. For the nation, however, the hearing was a moment of profound restoration. It proved that despite the deep divisions of the era, the mechanisms of accountability still worked when applied with discipline and evidence. The final image of the saga was not one of triumph, but of sobriety. It was the image of a folder being closed, a briefcase being latched, and a room being cleared of its theatrical props. The truth had not won in a cinematic sense, it had simply endured, and in that endurance, it had rendered the loudest man in Washington silent. The era of the performance was over, and the era of the evidence had begun. As the American people looked forward, they did so with a newfound understanding that while words can be used to weave a story, only the facts can secure a future. God bless the professionals who protect the secrets, the veterans who keep the oaths, and the citizens who never stop demanding the truth.